Glad you asked. I just finished my first bowl of homegrown strawberries.
Oh,
It's I just wanted to help you all. Um, it's about 78, sunny, warm, full-blown spring with birds everywhere. I can hear the bees buzzing out of my window.
ah, lovely.
Cool. Julie, you want to do a
Yeah.
short intro?
I'm Julie Deline, and I'm up in Zimmerman, Minnesota, where it's raining a lot, which is nice. I'm glad it is raining. And I have my own consulting business, Move as One, where I bring mindfulness into team building and strategic planning and moving through change. So grateful to be here.
Great. This will be great.
And Joe, how about you?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Joe Hennessy. Proud Duluthian, but find myself living here in Minneapolis, St. Paul the past 20 years, where I work for the Metropolitan Airports Commission. I have the honor of leading our airside or airfield operation here. So been working with Kathy and Daniel for a few years as a member of our executive sustainability committee. So delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Great. Great to have you.
Yeah, he has great vision of how to integrate everything. Frank, how about you? Could you share a little bit about yourself? You're on mute. So
Yeah, you're asking me. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm in the Netherlands, somewhere in Europe. Yeah, small place. It's the spring is coming, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you all. I have a high regard of the things you want to create together.
And Cindy, you want to share a little bit about yourself with Katherine, or so she knows who's kind of in the room?
Sure. Oh my gosh. I've been a leadership development professional for a very long time. Just got out of running executive coaching function for both, well, Target Corporation and leadership academies for Cargill, so Fortune 30 companies, and wanting to get back in to doing more good in the world. So I'm heading back to civic and NGO organizations. I tried the change from within long enough. Thank you.
I'm the action, please.
Okay, so we'll start up and others might show up as we go, but it's my pleasure today to introduce Katherine Tyler Scott. She is a principal of KI ThoughtBridge Consulting. I know her through her leadership of the International Leadership Association. She was board chair for a number of years, helping to lead the organization through its ongoing evolution. And I've known Katherine through that organization for a number of years. I think we're beyond a decade now, as maybe two, and have just been continually impressed by the quality of her thinking and her thoughtfulness in how she sees the world and what she invites us and calls us to pay attention to. And so I'm really honored that she has agreed to share her current thinking of this moment and the reality of this moment and what it might be calling us to do. So we'll share that and introduce you and have you started up.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Kathleen and I are almost like two peas in a pod in many ways in terms of our never kind of accepting things as they are, but wondering what can be done to improve or make things better and stretching people to think. And that's why I gravitated toward her out of the many, many thousands of people who've been at ILA conferences. And so I'm delighted to be able to be with all of you too, because I know that she has spoken so highly of all of the people who are engaged in this conversation. And what you're doing is, I think, enriching the dialogue, the questions, the community, the larger community of ILA. And I joined ILA at maybe the second meeting they had. So I've been involved for a very, very long time. And part of what's been happening in the last couple of years at the conference is that there are a small group of people like Kathy who are questioning whether or not we are meeting the moment as an organization. And are there some things that we should be asking ourselves or doing differently or better to meet this moment? And it really calls then for us to what I call read the larger reality accurately and truthfully in order to respond responsibly. And so when I was asked to help develop the conversation in San Diego, what we call the D-Lab, the overarching question was, how might we exercise leadership that responds meaningfully to the issues of this moment? And my opening comments were very brief, but as Kathleen said, they're a little provocative. But for me, they're my truth. What I'm hoping to have you do is to share your own reading of reality later and have a deeper conversation. One of the people who has deeply influenced my work is Parker Palmer. And he would always say, Katherine, deep speaks unto deep. And so that's what I'm hoping we'll have in this time together. I'm going to share my slides, share my screen so you can see what I planned today and for this conversation. And see if everybody can see. Can everyone see?
Yep.
So my goal is to engage questions through constructive dialogue that will increase trust, improve communication, and develop more respectful relationships. That is the work that I do professionally and in my work with corporations, philanthropic organizations, and educational systems as well. So the agenda is, after the welcome, give you a brief overview of what we're going to be doing. Then I want to talk a little bit about context and how it matters in our conversation. And then I'm going to share two models, one of which you're very familiar with. And the other one is something that ThoughtBridge developed out of its decades of work, starting with the Harvard Negotiation Project. And then hopefully there'll be time for a large group discussion, or if there are more people, small group discussions. And then we'll have a summary and conclusion to this conversation. It's really not a conclusion, it's just sort of a placeholder, because you continue to have conversations. So I hope that's what you came for. So I just want to talk a lot about change today, but before I get into that in any real detail, I want to talk a little bit about context and why context matters. For me, context really is about creating an understanding of the situation that informs and shapes your thinking, your perception, and ultimately your actions. So it's your own sort of like reading of what's going on. And my reading, or the context I think in which we're having this conversation, is one of the most turbulent and disruptive ones, I think, in the history of humanity. And people have only compared it to two other times. There may be others that you've thought of, but I do believe we're in the global grip of fear, and I think a terrorizing regression and projection of the worst within us onto whomever we perceive as the other. There's a rise in racism, in white nationalism, anti-Semitism, unrelenting attacks on the globe, the preservation of wonder. There are unrelenting attacks on democracy, rising hatred, and violence towards certain ethnic and religious groups. So we are all aware of these things, but because it's a troubling history of what I would call traditionally attacking traditionally marginalized groups and escalating, which I think is the worst thing, attacks on facts, reason, and truth. Now, no one has the corner on truth. I don't care how brilliant you may be, none of us has the corner on truth, but collectively and in conversation and dialogue, we can come to a sense of the fuller truth. And so we have gone through what I call a time of repression and denial, which has now erupted into something that seems almost out of control. And what has long been denied and repressed, we know, has resurfaced with a vengeance. And psychologically speaking, we know that whatever we don't own will own us. And in this particular case, I'm talking about the shadow. And we are in the grip of a shadow. And if we don't own the shadow, then the shadow will own us. So people like this group and those beyond this group who are willing to probe more deeply and ask the deeper questions are, I think, the people that will help us get through this really difficult time. It's a time in which we need to see a different context and one that is transformational, not deformative, and that integrates rather than isolates. And I think it will bring us together rather than divide us. But it's going to take what I call a lot of the inner work of leaders like us. So I think we are gathered today really because all of us believe that there is an alternative context that will not enable what I call this debilitating legacy inherited from a paradigm that has placed the power in the hands of a very few while marginalizing the masses. So our work really in leadership really does matter. The two processes that I want to share are going to be next. And if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, don't hesitate to raise your hand. And if I can't see you, I'm sure one of the group will help me to stop. Now, this is very familiar to all of you, but it has changed over time. And it is a model that ThoughtBridge has really developed because it's an integrated model in a way of explaining change. But it certainly starts with Kurt Lewin and the Lippitt's, Ronald in particular, in terms of the 3 phases of change. And it has gone through many, many developmental phases, culminating right now with John Cotter's work, who has a more complicated and complex explanation. But if you look at this model to understand change and transition, we're talking about 3 basic phases. The first one being people recognizing that things are different and they're not going to be the same again, that there is an ending to something. And the ending is a time when people are in denial. The majority of people are in denial and resistance, primarily out of fear and sometimes just out of ignorance and isolation. You can see a small sliver of people who are already in what I call the second phase, and then a larger group, maybe double, who are already at the new beginning, like many of you who see the possibilities and have a vision for how sustainability can really improve the state of people's lives worldwide. The second phase is the gap, the in-between phase, I call it, in which there's a lot of confusion, but also the beginning of seeing that there is a better way, and then the ability to let go of what has been familiar and comfortable and entering into a place where it is not. And you can see there that you now have a huge shift from this small sliver of people in the first phase to almost 3 times as many people now saying, I know things are going to have to change. I'm not sure where we're going, but I'm going to have to deal with it. To people who are saying, still fighting and looking for a way to revert back to the ending phase, if at all possible. And still, now you see, there's still the same number of people in the new beginning. But when you get to phase 3, which is again the period of what I call enactment, and I call it integration and application of the change, institutionalizing it in a way that the culture actually does shift and change. And this happens over time. And by the way, if they're not discrete little phases, it's basically very organic because, as we said, change is a process, not an event. And actually, over time, it's back and forth. If you see it as cyclical, each time you go through it, hopefully people in your institution become more competent, more able to manage the change. That's if they're equipped with the tools to manage that change. And I'll talk a little bit about that again. So really what we're talking about is helping people navigate the world of what is and changing to the world of what can be. But they can't get to the world of what can be, and we know this from research, and Cotter has shown this, that I think almost 95% of change efforts fail. And they fail because people are afraid to go through the gap, the time of no longer and the time of not yet, that in-between phase in which there is heightened anxiety, ambiguity, confusion, anger, fear, but also hope. Whether hope prevails or not has a lot more to do with leadership than most people know, but you know. But it has to be a special kind of leadership and a special kind of skill development. I call them, as Ron Heifetz describes them in his book, adaptive leadership skills. And for us, it's not the same as Ron's work. And by the way, I worked with Ron for a number of years when I was directing the Lilly Endowment's Leadership Education Program. That program was a statewide program that went to a national program. And what we learned is if you don't equip leaders with knowledge and understanding of context, which is history, they have to be well grounded in the history, whether it's the history of their organization or their state or their city or their country or the world. They have to have some understanding and grasp of that. And then they have to have a solid center of core values and beliefs that actually form an ethical framework for how they perceive and how they act, how they read the larger reality. And then their ability to communicate effectively in a way that helps people move through the most difficult time of change, which is the gap. And the last thing is the ability to build trust, which is not an easy thing because trust is not something, it's a very complicated thing. There's trust, three kinds of trust really. There's the trust that you know what you're doing. There's the trust that you are congruent with your beliefs and values. And then there's the trust that you have some integrity. So there are lots of different trusts, but the ability to do that helps people to feel grounded and secure as you're leading them through what I call the gap. And if you want sustainable change, there's just no shortcut through the gap. So what does it take? What kind of leadership does it take to get people through the gap? It's what we call the integrated model of leadership. And this model really is about skills and also about performance and outcomes. So the skills we're talking about are technical and adaptive skills. And those skills, as you know from the research, technically speaking, are those things like your education, your experience, your knowledge, the things that you know that work mostly. And they're usually things that you can actually codify and give to another person, and they can learn those things, and they're really, really well equipped to do their jobs. However, they can do these things sometimes without even having to deal with people, as we are learning in this new age. But the adaptive skills are those skills that absolutely require the ability to work with the people who have the problems and who are struggling with the issues that need to be resolved. So in order to solve the problem, you have to engage those people who have the problem and who are trying to solve the problem. And it's a very different kind of leadership. So this intersection between the skills is what I call the inner and the outer work. And the inner work is the capacity to engage in what I call that self-reflection, self-knowledge, that leads to more awareness, empathy, insight, and self-mastery, which, by the way, is what sets the most effective leaders apart when you talk about emotional intelligence, is this ability right here, the inner work of the leader. And of course, then the outer work is actually the performance, the outcome. We're just not navel gazing, we're actually using our skills and working with individuals engaged in this work in order to achieve outcomes. And those are usually measurable. And also there's a way to make people accountable as well. So these two models, first of all, the 3-phase change model with the imposition of the psychological behaviors on them. And this particular model is the one that we use a lot in working with, whether they're foundations, businesses, or educational systems. Higher ed in particular, work with a lot of colleges and universities. So what I would like to do now is to entertain any questions, thoughts before you go into groups, or if, Kathy, do you think that everyone can stay in the same room, or do you want to divide the group? It's kind of up to them to entertain some questions that I have come up with, but also some questions that you may have that you want to explore.
I would suggest breakout rooms so that more people can have a chance to share and listen. So maybe we do 4 breakout rooms of 3 of 3 and 1 of 2, or we could do 3 breakout rooms of 4s and.
Okay. So these are some guidelines that I have. I don't know what ones you have. They may be better. But one I would suggest is please use iMessages and take responsibility for what you think and what you feel and what you want, and to be respectful of others as well. Every single one of you has extremely important expertise, and you know that. Be respectful of the differences and be respectful of other people sharing. So confidentiality is important. Now, that means that you can share whatever the person says if you have their permission. But if you don't, then you can't. You can talk about what you said or did, but no one else, unless you have their permission. And for me, this is really serious conversation, but I understand this group does have a great sense of humor. So I hope we'll have a little bit of fun as well. Conversation. No. So the group conversations these are the invitational questions that I had. Of course, the larger question that was in the International Leadership Association's convening in San Diego is how might we exercise leadership that responds meaningfully to the issues of this moment? I think we sort of like the second question probably a little bit more. It's a little more meaty, but what is your reading of reality? You've heard mine, and how does it affect your thinking, teaching, and practice of leadership? And then the third one that you might want to use as well is, given the pace of change, which people say is more rapid than any other time in history, how can we be less reactive and more proactive?
So do we want to invite any generalized conversations or questions that people have before we break into groups?
Yes.
Okay. So anybody have something that they would like either to throw out on the table for everybody to ponder, or a question specifically for Katherine and her take on it?
Yes, that would be very good to do.
Maybe from me, so thank you, Katherine. So for me, it would be really helpful to make the model a bit alive, yeah? So maybe you can share an example where you have used it or where you have seen the impact of it. For me, it's just a couple of words right now, and it doesn't live yet.
That's okay, thank you, Frank. Well, yes, I will, and I'll definitely make sure I protect the confidentiality of the client. We were invited to work with a private foundation on the West Coast. I'll just say that. The founder of the foundation really wielded a lot of power and a lot of influence and pretty much ran things. So the board of the foundation basically was an advisory group and not a governing board. But we were called in to help this group become more what I call trustees of the institution, because the founder died unexpectedly, and the group was definitely thrown from what I would call phase 1 into the gap, where there was a lot of confusion. And what I have found, we found this even with communities where we've gone into full communities who are at war with each other. is that often when people are feeling this kind of level of anxiety and uncertainty, they turn on each other. They start to attack one another rather than attacking the problem. And this is what was happening in this group, in their meetings, that people were dealing with their grief and their anger and their uncertainty by turning on one another. So we actually had to help them understand the process of change intellectually before we started talking about it personally, because it would have been a little bit too invasive. But seeing that model, they could begin to have some distance and see what they were doing and why they were doing it, and what had happened to them over time, that they had become not a governing board, but an advisory board. And now they were being expected to be the trustees of the institution with a large, large sum of money that was left by the founder. So in the last year, we have been working with this group to help them deal with, one, their grief, and two, their fidelity to the founder, because the fidelity has to be much larger than to the founder. Legally, there are some responsibilities that they have as well. So we've been working with them and helping them to talk about what it has been like to lose the person who really ran everything and to assume the responsibilities that they now have. And they've reached the point now where we are actually working with them on conflict resolution and what I would call the adaptive work of leadership. So does that help, Frank? Did that help a little?
A little, yeah. So if you say adaptive work, yeah, I'm very curious what that entails, but maybe that's not appropriate.
Well, this is very true. Well, I know you've read a lot of Ron Heifetz's work, or have you not?
No, I know about the theory of adaptive work, of course, but I don't know the author you're referring to. No.
Oh, Ronald Heifetz. Okay. Well, I work with Ronald Heifetz.
Yeah.
Well, people don't, leaders who have high positions don't like to think of themselves as not being in control of their emotions or not being aware of their own behavior sometimes in terms of other people. So our work really is to help them understand that their behavior is affecting the whole system. It's a lot of Ed Friedman's work, Leadership in Crisis, where there's a connection between the individual's development and the organization's development over time. And you want to help leaders understand that they have an impact on the larger system and that their behavior does. For example, the characteristics of an anxious system are a lot of reactivity, where there's impulsive action and in the moment decision making. So if you're working with an organization like that, you see this behavior, you can help them see that that is not helpful, that that is not going to help them resolve the problem, and that they have to help individuals slow down, understand that quick decision making may not be a helpful thing to the organization, that change takes time, and it really does. Often in the gap, there's a lot of group think that people have to think the same way. It's sort of either or thinking, it's either this or it's that. And the ambiguity is not tolerable. So teaching people to just hold that space and not move to making decisions too quickly is helpful. And then sometimes, like I said, there's scapegoating and blaming that goes on as well. And so people want to get out of that mode and fix it quickly. So we try to help people get out of the blaming, quick fix mentality and being stuck, where they try harder and harder and harder to solve the problem, but they only make it worse because they haven't been able to step back and see what the real problem is. And so there's a regression in the system when that happens. And so our job is to help them see how they're contributing to it and what they can do to stop it.
You know, Katherine, your comments invite me to kind of remember that we have this, these mental frameworks that we use in our work. But we also have this kind of framework of practice. How does it show up in behavior? And then but your work also deeply reminds us that neither of those things can be cut off from the emotions, individual and collective emotions of the group. And so it raises, so I've been using this simple kind of framework that when I run into anger, the emotion underneath anger usually is hurt, and the emotion underneath control is usually fear. And so sometimes you can read the emotion actually through the behavior. And I'm wondering if you have some other little shortcuts that you use to help read the emotions underneath maybe what is being said or how people are behaving in a system.
Well, there are no shortcuts, but and you do,
Learning, wisdom, learning that you've learned over the years doing this, insights.
yes, well, you have to have done your own work, or you can't really help a group deal with its own emotionality, which is heightened during the gap, unless you've done your own work in that way. So that's why I say the inner work is so important with looking at how your emotions are in a situation like that and how you're managing those. And that takes a lot of, I think, coaching, sometimes coaching, also some just self-work. So what I have asked people to do often, though, is to use what we call the ladder of inference, which comes from MIT's research. And if you've read any of the Fifth Discipline book, you will probably find this very familiar. But the ladder of inference is a way to cut out what we call single loop learning. And I will just give you an example. So if you immediately in a room full of people, hear something that you don't like, and you immediately go to an angry response or a resistant response, do you then respond out of that resistance, or do you go back down to the ladder and say, what happened? What is it that triggered me? What conclusion did I come to? And how am I feeling about it? And then what did I say or do? Because if you do that, then you probably are going to be able to engage in a more reasonable conversation, one that's not laden with a lot of emotionality. The ladder of inference is something we use a lot. And we teach people that tool first so that if something happens in the room, they can not escalate it, but de-escalate it by doing this kind of process first. It takes a lot of coaching, but it works. So I have landed in neighborhoods in states where I've had to be escorted immediately to the president's office because there's been a what I would call a gathering of people protesting outside of the office because of this sort of reactive kind of behavior. We see it even now in our politics, reactive behavior without thought. And so then teaching the leader how to deal with that rather than escalating it is part of the work that you do when you do its inner work and adaptive work. So the leader is reflective of what goes on in the group often, and I think you know that, but they reflect the culture. They often are the architects or co-architects of it. So it's how you behave that affects the system. And you have to be well differentiated in that kind of an environment. And so that's what we teach people how to do. And then, of course, conflict resolution, which is helping people to divorce their personal feelings from the situation and deal with it logically and reasonably. So we have 7 elements that we teach people how to deal with conflict and ways to deal with change that are sustainable. Any other
questions,
or thoughts?
connections?
Is this all familiar?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for speaking up.
Yeah.
The practice. Go ahead, Marianne.
No, I was just going to say it's been a bit since I've heard Ron, the adaptive leadership mentioned, and it's having, it's needed more than ever. These concepts and there is no easy answer, or it's a technical answer, and the reinforcement of doing your own work. Sometimes I think in the realities of daily living, right? Or I'm working with this real active small nonprofit, and these people, these positional leaders are stepping really fast every day just to, do things and get things done. So doing one's own work in my old days of leadership development, I used to really, let's focus on that first. Let's focus on that first. And that's a luxury, almost really for people who are in the realities of the day, so how to work with that and teach that and support these people in a way that they got to do it all at the same time, be in the gap, take things out ahead, do their own work, fix the thing that's still in the ditches back here, and deal with their emotions in the ditches. Anyway, it's just the pace is.
It's a dance in a way, and you're holding the space for this all to happen. But that's why your own development is so critical. I don't think there's been much attention really paid to the self-development of the leader because of the fear, Marianne, that we're not doing anything and we're not making things happen, and we have to respond to what's going on.
Yeah.
To both ends, as you're saying, it's really both and. And as I said, it's not even sequential. It's like all over the place.
Yeah.
That's why knowing who you are, knowing what your own strengths are, is so critical. We're not perfect. We're not all knowing. And it's good if you have a colleague to do this work with you, but if you don't, then you really have to stay grounded and ask yourself the questions that you're asking others first, and then I think intervene.
Daniel, you had your hand up.
Yeah, this is striking a chord because I've been having quite a few conversations with folks who are in the weeds. They're doing the things, it's hard for them to pull themselves out. And every time I bring up this idea of what if you made time for yourself, there's like this emotional response. They know they need it.
Yes.
And a really practical thing that I've started doing, I used to do kind of just like this sharpening the saw day, it's a month, and I could never hold it. It would always get filled up. Even though I tried, I had great intentions. But what shifted for me since November is two of my friends and colleagues, we all work in this professional space, but not for the same company, are doing it together. We start the day, we set our intention for how we're going to spend the time together. We block off the day. Nobody expects anything from us. Sometimes I've even, like, when I first started, I just put PTO on my calendar, even though I was working, so that my team wouldn't bother me. Now I'm telling them that I'm doing this. And then we do our own thing, and we come back at the end of the day and we check in and say, what did I get done today? And sometimes getting things done is I took time to rest and restore myself. Sometimes it's deep work. Sometimes it's zooming way out and thinking really strategically. And I just did this with my business partner, who is very focused, outcome driven in the business a lot. And it took a while to like get him to the place, but we did it last Friday. And I checked in at the end of the day. I'm like, so Net Promoter Score, would you do this again? Would you recommend it to somebody else? And he said, Daniel, I feel so much at ease going into the weekend. I don't feel like I've got all these things on my plate. I would do this again, and I think I would do it more frequently. So I think like the summary there is like, I think most people know they need this.
Yeah.
They're afraid to take it because of the do attitude and culture. But once they experience it, they're like, oh, I can do this. And in fact, I'm better when I do this. So maybe that's something that people can take back and a practical application of what that looks like.
That's an excellent example. Thank you. As you're getting support and reinforcement for this new behavior, that's very helpful. You do need that in your culture. What do we realize, though, the impact that our behavior has on when you're in a position of power and influence? So if you're the head of your agency or the leader of it, you model for people what is acceptable or not. No matter what you're saying, what you do is probably more powerful. And so you're giving them permission to do that kind of thing and take care of themselves. And that makes for a healthier culture, and a culture in which people can be okay with one, making mistakes and saying, I made a mistake and I need help or I need support. Those are the cultures that can, in crisis, Daniel, respond responsibly because there's a cohesiveness. So thank you for sharing.
Today, for example, I was liaising with a client, and they asked for a more systemic approach working with ecosystems, do innovation 50 times of 50% faster. And then also, yeah, let's say do the vertical development, all that. So how to bridge that paradox that it's building on what people have said. That there's a high pace. There's a need to slow down.
Mm.
But how to do that?
Mhm. Mhm.
How can your model?
That's a challenge.
Especially, if time is money. I mean, if you have income and revenue because of the number of people seen, for example, in an agency, and then people slow down and don't see those people, then there's no income to pay the other people to take over the work when you're not there. I speak nothing about what Daniel faces, for example, or something when you have your own business, but
You definitely have to deal with the realities, don't you? And you do compromise from time to time. But over time, the leaders who don't do this kind of work get out of touch in a way that is detrimental not only to them, but also to the culture in which they lead. The lack of self-awareness of any leader means that there are parts of themselves that they are out of touch with, but are still being projected out into the culture.
Mary Ellen,
Yeah. Do we need to go to small groups, Kathleen? I don't want to.
we do. I wanted to give Mary Ellen a chance to comment or ask a question, and then we'll check the small group box.
Okay, thanks.
You're muted, Mary Ellen, so you might want to unmute.
I'm particularly interested because two things. I have joined the Global Regenerators community with Laura Sturm and Giles Hutchins, and we just had a session this morning. And the basic questions that we were working on is exactly what you're referring to, the way they phrased their questions to us. And what we worked on for several hours are in order to have an embodied approach for ourselves as individuals or in working with organizations. It's significant to be a representative of life. And the questions that develop from that or with that in order to generate that thought process that they offered are, what's alive for me? What does this activate in me? And what's my relationship to the essence of life? I think these are deep, personal, intimate conversations with ourselves. And how does my life, my actions, project, profiles, relationships align with the logic of life? And it, I think it was a pretty profound discussion that we had individually and in small groups, thinking about the significance of that inner work to be in balance with our outer work.
Yes.
And I remember coming across this concept when I was working on my master's thesis many years ago. And it's also considered to be prayer. Prayer as in having a conversation. That's essentially all prayer is, how simple, with our higher self, with our inner self. Who are we and how do we want to be in relation to our life and how others and we perceive ourselves?
Those are fundamental and profound questions, and they're universal as well, Mary Ellen.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we will move into breakout groups. These questions are in the chat room, and we'll invite you. We got 15 minutes, so we'll do about 7 to 8 minutes of small group, and then come back to share what insights we might have invited into our conversations.
Thank you for setting up the breakout rooms, Kathy.
Sorry about leaving, Cindy. I had to pull us all back.
Mm.
Daniel and Marianne, you want to take us home, or with the report
Go for
out?
it, Marianne.
Sure. I can dig in here. I'll just do the debrief a little bit and then Daniel can close us out. But just we had 3 groups, and does anybody want to be a spokesperson for their trio or small group? But just what did you end up spending a little time on? Anybody want to go first?
I had profound wisdom in my group, and I think they should feel free to share.
Talking about you, Dan.
Well, Sean shared, I'm going to share yours, Sean, that he has created No Meeting Fridays, and he realized that 2 to 3 Fridays a month he's able to hold to that, and the person who violates that the most is himself. But it was a way as an introvert ambivert for him to create space in his week to have that time without incessant meetings. And it's worked pretty well, it sounds like.
I think I was with Sean and Daniel, who do a lot of reading of the external reality, but in balance do their own inner reading as well. And they know when they reached a point where they need to be refueled, replenished, take time away from the busyness and the demands, other people's demands, to be able to meet other people's needs best. And I think that's so healthy and wise. I think it's very hard to follow a leader who says one thing and does another. So that doesn't build trust.
Thank you. How about the next group? Dale, you're shaking your head. Yes, so you had a group going. Would you mind sharing a little?
I would just share what I was talking about in our community, is a small community. We are sometimes we're actually just learning to work together, and I have to say, with Kathy's help and also spreading these concepts that were discussed today amongst our leadership, we are breaking down those silos and gaining ground in McCook, and it's been wonderful. I appreciate today because it reinforces the definitions and reframing the ideas about especially what you talked about, anger, masking the hurt that's there. And once you understand that hurt's there, we can address that when we can get them in a room and start talking about that. So.
Yeah,
Great.
wonderful. And then in our third group was Frank and I and Mary Ellen. Frank, you're unmuted, so we're going to go down and go to you. Do you want to share anything?
Oh, okay. No, I think it reinforced the key message we got today anyway. So the importance of vertical development, or being more adaptive. And that paradoxically takes a lot of time for yourself in a very turbulent world. And then Mary Ellen shared a beautiful quote. Think more with your heart and feel more with your mind. So that's something we want to unravel more. But if you do that, things will get in order.
Well done, Frank. Thank you.
And I shared this in the small group as well, but I ran into an interesting conversation with Ron Heifetz a while ago, and he mentioned that when you run into people who are resistant, your resistance actually means, either personally or in someone else that you're working with, means that they're still struggling with the issue. So we often think of resistance as a person stopping everything to push back, but his perception is that that when you resist, that the energy you're using to resist is something that gets released once you move past the resistance. So the energy you're putting into resistance is actually something that tells you that you're still struggling with the paradox or the ambiguity or the challenge of what you're trying to resist. And so that gives me hope that there's movement underneath what we see as non-movement.
That's true, because it's energy being spent.
Yeah, so true.
To hold something in place.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to close us out. Katherine, thank you so much for stimulating a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you asking us, like, notice the times, let's be honest, and are we meeting them? It's a very provocative question. As well as asking us to reflect on what does this mean for our own leadership and how are we responding? Just so grateful for the conversations in the small group. I do want to let everybody know that next month we are meeting on May 21st, same time. So I don't know all the time zones, but 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 Pacific. I don't know my European time zones. I apologize. But next month it will be on Tuesday, May 21st. And the topic is still being solidified. We have maybe somebody to talk about the leadership program recap from the UN conference in April from Amman. But if he's not there, not available, his schedule might be shifting. We will have a different thought-provoking topic. Hope you all have a great afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine,
Everyone.
very much.
Nice to see you again, Catherine. Thank
Great
you.
to see you too. I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you. This is
Yeah,
great.
This is great, Catherine. If you, well, I was going to ask her to send her slides. We'll get.
I've got to hop to another meeting. Be well.
Okay. You take
Bye,
care.
Daniel.
Bye. We'll see. We can
Hello.
see each other. So I was thinking I would do a multi-year 500 a year kind of gift.
Oh, that would
That
be
sound okay?
wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah, thank
I'm
you.
gonna email Lynn and it'll come through UBS. They have
Okay.
yeah, some of my required minimum distribution accounts, and so
Oh, yeah. Well, that would be just, yeah, just that's something too they can count on, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Rather than this episodic lurching back and forth or whatever, so.
Yeah. Well, the Pachamama Alliance, maybe this is something that your folks, Acres for Change, might find interesting, but they have what they call evergreen supporters.
Okay,
So an evergreen supporter is something that renews every single year to support the work of the organization.
nice. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, I'm gonna make a note of that. Thank
And
you.
they build that over time. Some organizations do monthly withdrawals from checking accounts
Sure,
as
yeah.
a part of that work, to structure it in another way or one time, withdrawal every year. That's how they support their operating costs.
Well, I'm using the metaphor. That's
The
sweet.
metaphor is great, the
That's-
evergreen, yeah.
evergreen.
Metaphor.
I had a couple of ahas during this too. So yeah, I ended up, like I said, this Tuesday mornings, this is this little, I would call it a leadership team group that we've launched through my working with them, and we ended up